Adam Smith Works is delighted to welcome Russ Roberts, the host of Econ Talk and research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Hi, Russ.
Great to be here.
Glad that you're with us today. We have been collecting questions from Twitter and Facebook and all over social media from folks who are long-distance fans and friends of yours and folks who know you personally. And so if you don't mind, we're just going to kind of run through a list and see where we get.
Great.
We're going to start with some questions about Adam Smith because you're here visiting with us this evening to give a lecture in just a little while on your book, Adam Smith, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life. And conveniently, our first question is about your book, How Adam Smith Can Change Your Life.
Thank goodness I've read it. But maybe not as recently as you have, so that's always awkward for the guest.
I feel like you should be able to answer this one authoritatively.
Well, we'll see.
So one of your fans asks, in your book, you use a lot of examples about your own family. What importance does Smith place on the family, and how does the family help us better sympathize with one another?
Well, it's an interesting question because, as probably many of the people watching this video know, Adam Smith never married, didn't have any children, was close to his mother, so his understanding of the family was tempered and affected by that life experience of his, no doubt. He doesn't say much about the family explicitly. He doesn't say much about how to raise children, say, or how to take care of your aging parents, which was something he did know something about. But what he did talk about, I think that's important, is how our ability to empathize with each other extends out in circles with more intensity in the immediate family, and then less and less intensity as we get further away from the people that we're related to. And we have our close family, then we have our more distant relatives and friends and acquaintances, then we might have people we know a little bit, and then there's strangers. And he spends a lot of time talking about how our responses to the ups and downs of life of the people around us, we tailor those to how close we are to them and how close they are to us, and how we respond to those events in their lives and how we share the events of our life depends on what circle the people around us are in. Let's say something else maybe about Smith and family. What was the last part of the question?
How does the family help us better sympathize with one another? Yeah,
I don't know the answer to that. Smith certainly understood that our ability to sympathize with people who were like us was easier than sympathizing with people who aren't like us, people we interact with regularly, more than we can sympathize with people who we don't interact with regularly.
Maybe family can be maybe a site where we practice sympathizing with people, and then we can take it out in the big world, right? You have to learn to be nice to your sister.
Yeah, that's the romantic version. I think I talk about this in the book. One of the stranger experiences, I think, of human intimacy and relationship is that you will say things to the people you love and treat them in ways that you wouldn't do with a stranger that would seem to go against the idea that they're closest to you, right? So I think I give the example in the book where you're in an argument with your spouse. I don't know if you've ever had an argument with your
Certainly
spouse.
Not.
No, I haven't either. But what I hear is that sometimes in the middle of that discussion, then it might be somewhat heated. And you're very emotional, and you're having a very often a physical reaction in the intensity of that conversation about something that maybe you've disappointed the other person with, or failed to do something you should have done, or stepped on somebody's toes, and your phone rings, and it's important because you've promised someone you're going to take the call. And despite the fact that you're in this intense relationship and conversation with someone you're close to, you answer the phone, and when you answer the phone, you suddenly, as if a switch had been flicked, you say, "Don't you see I'm trying?" Hello? And how is that possible? But we can do that. And I think we say to ourselves, oh, she'll understand because she's my wife. He'll understand. He's my husband. Of course they'll cut me slack. And of course, I feel like, at least in principle, it should go the other way. We should always treat our loved ones better than we treat strangers. And yet, I think sometimes we fall short of that. And it's just kind of an interesting Smithian, I don't know why it's Smithian. I'm not sure what Smith would say about it, but it's the kind of situation he would be aware of and interested in.
All right, I think we could probably talk about Smith and the family probably for the whole length of this interview, so I'm going to move us on through it and apologize both to you and to the listeners for moving us off the interesting question. So another listener wrote in to ask, Smith writes about economics and really writes the first great classic of modern economics before economics exists as a discipline.
Yeah.
He pretty much builds the plane while he's flying it. Right. So how do you think that impeded or helped his process, the questions he was the questions he was asking, the kinds of answers that he found?
Well, I think the advantage for him was he wasn't constrained by expectations of what economics is or isn't. Certainly that's true in his writing generally. He didn't see himself as an economist. I'm not even sure there was such a term at the time. If anything, you would call him a social scientist, because the breadth of his interest includes psychology, sociology, anthropology, what we call economics, certainly history. Very deeply interested in human nature, what makes us tick. So in that great expanse, there are things that we call economics: interest rates, supply of money, wages, specialization, the wealth of nations, and so on. But he didn't see himself bounded the way a modern economist might, at least going up until maybe 20, 30 years ago, bounded by the things that everyone would call economics. Everyone knows are economics, like interest rates and employment and jobs and wages and so on. So he was just a very curious person. He was interested in understanding how the world works, and he wasn't hampered or encumbered by an idea of what economics is supposed to be or should be. And he also wrote very well. I always like to point that out. He was not the first person to write about these topics. I wouldn't say almost everything, but many of the things he is famous for, he was not the person to write about them first, and some of his ideas are not uniquely his. But he wrote about them with such insight and such clarity that they still speak to us today. And I think it's an interesting lesson about communication. Say anything else about Smith as economist? Certainly he was interested in data, at least in the abstract. He's interested in the pin factory, how many pins you can make in a certain period of time.
The price of herring.
The price of herring, for sure. The wages of teachers. And yet, at the same time, he's really of a different era, where he does what I would call narrative economics. He tells a story. I think we all tell stories. We all still tell stories. Sometimes we use math and sometimes we don't. But he didn't use math. He used what we would normally just call stories, and to help us understand how things work. And so in that sense, he was doing a kind of economics that we've lost to some extent.
And of course, he's not just an economist, right?
No.
His other big book is The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which I think a lot of economists like even better than they like The Wealth of Nations.
Not many, actually. You know all of them. Yeah, I think you know
may know
all of
unusual
them.
economists.
Yeah, for sure.
But apparently Smith thought Theory of Moral Sentiments was more important and more significant than The Wealth of Nations. Do you think he was right?
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I think that's a somewhat apocryphal story that it was his, quote, favorite book. Of course, he only had two, so one of them he had to call his favorite, or he could have said he loved them both equally, which would probably be a lie, but it's a neglected book, his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. Certainly he saw himself as a moral philosopher rather than a economist per se, because that's what they had then. He was interested in morality, how morality came to be, why people treated each other the way they did, and that's the focus of that first book, written in 1759. And that is, trying to understand how people interact with each other on a face-to-face basis. And what I'm going to talk about tonight in my talk is how he's interested in how we get along. And he's also interested in how we get along commercially, which is what his other book's about, The Wealth of Nations. So in my view, both books are about harmony. They're about how we interact with each other in ways that are remarkably peaceful and harmonious, despite our self-interest, even though we're self-interested. Now, nominally, the focus of the Theory of Moral Sentiments is why do we do anything that's not self-interested? Because we do, obviously, but Smith didn't think we're very benevolent. He thought we were mainly self-interested, mainly motivated by self-love. I think he's probably right.
Okay. Someone else would like to know if there's a piece of advice from Adam Smith that you would give your younger self, say the Russ Roberts of 40 years ago.
Oh, that's such a thick book. I gave myself 40 years ago. Yeah, that's a tough one.
Buy Apple.
I missed that chapter. I think the most important advice in that book. I think there's two pieces of advice that are important. I don't know how well I knew them when I was younger. I certainly didn't know them as well as I know them now. But those two pieces of advice would be the importance of our relationships with others as a source of our lasting satisfaction and happiness, a sense of meaning in life, and also keeping things in perspective with respect to our ego, and how our natural impulse, Smith would say, is to seek out fame, glory, and wealth, because that way people pay attention to us. And I think that's a deep insight into what motivates people. Mm-hmm. There certainly were parts of my life and times of my life when I sought fame, wealth, and not so much power, which was his other, I think I may say glory, but he power. Never been particularly interested in power, but most people have some desire for at least one, if not all three of those three things: fame, money, power. And when we're younger, we can get a little overwhelmed by those if we're not careful. And Smith's about keeping those in perspective and seeking respect from others and attention from others and being what he called loved, which wasn't just romantic love, but respect, honor, and praise, and mattering, and a sense of importance and dignity. Smith saw those fame, money, and power as the wrong way to go about finding those. Finding love, finding respect, finding praise, and he instead suggested wisdom and virtue. Now, that's kind of a cliche. It's good advice. I think the deeper part of the advice is to be aware of your desire for those things, because I think when you're 18 or 20 years old or 25 or 30, you don't even think about it. And I think Smith forces you to think about it, and that's why I really love the theory of moral soundness.
Okay. Let's move to talking a little bit, now that we've been talking about fame and glory, let's talk a little bit about Econ Talk, which has brought you a little bit of fame over the years.
Yeah.
Minor amounts of glory. We'll take it.
It's nice.
As my kids say...
I'm a big fan of the show.
As my kids say,
fun of it.
People who don't know you sometimes know who you are. That's
yeah.
Which is kind
probably
of
true.
So let's talk a little bit about Econ Talk and maybe some of the guests that you have had on. What do you think makes for an ideal interviewee for Econ Talk?
Well, it's a little challenging because sometimes you read a book by an author and the author's phenomenal and you think this is one of the greatest books I've ever read, and then it turns out they don't like to talk. They don't talk well. They don't explain their book very well, and that can be very disappointing. So you need the ideal guest is somebody who's written a phenomenal book and who can talk about it, and that's not always the case, right? You also want a guest, and I've learned to try to do this over the years. I don't know how successful I am, but you want a guest who sees this opportunity as a chance to talk, to have a conversation, to exchange ideas. Most talk shows aren't like that. Mm-hmm. When you write a book, your PR people send out a list of questions for people who are going to interview the author so that the host doesn't have to spend any time actually reading the book. I don't do that. I read the book. I try to read the whole book. Don't always read every word, as I've often confessed publicly. I try to, but sometimes I don't. I lose interest. Made a mistake. It's not that interesting a book. But I try
Life is short.
Life is short. I try to read every page, if not every word. I try to make sure I haven't missed any key ideas. And my goal in the interview is twofold. One is to let the author expound on the ideas in the book, and the second is to interact with the author about those ideas. And I tell every guest before I interview them, I say, this works best as a conversation. There'll be times when I'll say something and I'll pause, and that means your turn. Just like a real conversation.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to answer, then I'll ask another question. But it is not as interesting to have a conversation that's just, I ask you a question and you answer it. Mm-hmm. And so the best guests get into the conversational part of it, and I've even had some guests, ask me questions. Yeah, but what do you think about it? I'm thinking, this is going well. First, I get to talk a little bit more. That's always pleasant, fame and glory, and all that. But also, more seriously, just it means that we're having real give and take, and you can hear it often in the author's or the guest's voice when the interview's over. Sometimes you hear this in their voice because they had low expectations. And I can hear them say, well, that was fun. Meaning I didn't expect it to be fun. But the second more is they're like, well, that was really a good conversation. And that's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the gold standard for me, to try to have a conversation with the guest where they encounter my encountering of their ideas or their book or their essay or whatever it is. And that's exhilarating when it goes well and you know that it's gone well. It's amazing.
Who would you like to have on that you haven't had on yet?
Who's alive? I mean, there's a lot of dead people.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, yeah.
They're harder to get. Adam Smith would be way up there, Hayek. I've been fortunate to interview a number of people who I would call my childhood heroes. They're not literally from my childhood, but my young days in reading and thinking, which it would include Milton Friedman, Bill James, who introduced the statistical methods to baseball that are now much more common, that were captured in Moneyball. Mark Halperin, my favorite living novelist, and maybe my favorite novelist, period. Just lots of, those are just fun. In fact, they're not as good as they should be, those interviews, because I'm a little bit starstruck sometimes, and I don't do as good a job as I should. I'm ashamed when I go back and listen to the Milton Friedman one, which I don't do often, but I have listened to it, since I did it, and I talked way too much. I wish I just shut up. It was 2006. It was the first year of Econ Talk, and I talked too much. So, but who would I have that I haven't had? I'd love to have Tom Stoppard, the author of Arcadia, which is my favorite play, which is a play of ideas. There are probably a few other people offbeat people like that. Mm-hmm. Most of the economists that I'd like to have are willing to come on and have been on the show, which is wonderful. Mm-hmm. Most people say yes, which is great. And I like to tell listeners anytime I can, if you suggest someone to me that's obvious to you would be a great EconTalk guest, it's possible I've asked them before and they just said no, or they're not interested, or they never responded, or I'm not interested. I don't want to interview them. Yeah. It's too scary. Not for me. Don't understand their work, or think it's really doesn't make sense to me. So I try not to. I try to find guests that I can learn something from, because I assume that my listeners will learn something from those guests as well. And one other sort of meta point about Econ Talk is I like the idea of my listeners listening to me grapple with the ideas to try to figure them out, because I think that's the way our brain learns. And so for the listener, I'm replicating their experience. I try to ask the question they would ask, because that would help them understand and clarify. It's why I sometimes repeat what a guest says, and I'm always uneasy when a guest says, exactly. I'm thinking, well, yeah, because it's your idea. But I'm not sure they're saying exactly because they agree with it, or they think, yes, that captures what I was trying to say. But that's what I'm trying to do in those settings.
That's great. All right, we have just a little bit of time left, so I want to ask you a couple of questions about you in particular that folks sent in. What are you reading for fun right now?
What am I reading for fun right now? There's not that much fun in my life, reading-wise. I do sometimes have a fun book. Like I did read the Brothers Karamazov this year for the first time, which is embarrassing, because it's one of the greatest novels I've ever read. And I can't believe it took till I was 64 years old. But and it's an extremely long book, so how I squeeze that in.
That probably counts for several.
I thought about doing an Econ Talk out of it, but I couldn't quite manage it yet. If I could get Jordan Peterson back on, maybe he'd talk to me for an hour about the Brothers Karamazov, because he likes to mention it at least. I'm thinking of reading Q&A, which is a novel on the movie Slumdog Millionaire was based on. So I often have something like that's a sort of fun book. There's a bunch of books that I'm reading that are kind of Econ Talk books, and then if I really like them when I'm done, I see if I can get the author on.
I have the same, the pleasure reading and the work.
Yeah, I try to make them go together if I can.
Reading list.
Yeah, so.
Who's the best teacher you ever had? which I think is such a great question.
Yeah, probably Miss Kinan, 8th grade, which I think I've mentioned Miss Kinan on the program before. Miss Kinan had a boundless energy that she brought to the room, a boundless passion for everything we learned, whether it was our production of My Fair Lady, whether it was reading Ulysses by Tennyson, which I quote in an upcoming Econ Talk episode, which I thank her for right now, because I might have come across it anyway, but because of her I had to memorize it, and I still know some of it by heart, not all of it. I did read this when I read it, but and most of all, she brought an unbounded expectation about what we were capable of. So Miss Kinan used to grade, she found the A through F scale a little too constraining. So she would go dip down into some of the lower letters. And you could get an M or a K. And then she'd use some minuses. Like you could get like a T triple minus. That was a really bad paper. At the other end, she felt that the A and A plus were insufficient. So, and I hope this isn't bragging too much, but I did get one of those low scores once.
Yeah.
But I did get an A septuple plus.
Oh, excellent.
Right? Which, I think, it's kind of like on Medium. Right now you can clap, and you can clap. There's no limit to how many times you can clap. You go, clap, 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 clap. And it's kind of stupid because it's like, they're free almost. They're just almost no cost to adding applause. But at the same time, it's kind of like, well, who cares? It's just a little bit of love. So the A septuple plus, she could have given an A, 30 plus. Maybe she did, and I never earned one. But
someone else in the class got the 30 plus.
And then I will just mention this would never happen in 2019, but Miss Kinan kept back one time after class a student who had handed in a shoddy piece of work. Mm-hmm. And humiliated that student. And he came late to lunch, which was the next period. Clearly he'd been crying for a long time. And I won't say who it was, but I will say he's had a very, very successful scientific career. Now, did Miss Kinan help that happen? Did she damage him? I don't know. But she used to say it's better to fill a quart container to the top than a gallon container, halfway. And I just, so I think she's my favorite teacher. Now, I had a lot of great economics teachers, which is probably what you're talking about, maybe. And I had a great philosophy teacher, Dick Smythe at University of North Carolina, who taught me about pragmatism, which I, 30 years later realized, oh yeah, Hayek, limits of reason. Yeah. That's like what Dick Smythe used to talk about. And I called him and I said, read Hayek? I'm thinking, well, he's a philosopher. Maybe he doesn't know. He goes, well, of course. So he's gone now. May he rest in peace. But those great teachers stick with you. I could tell you 10 stories about Dick Smythe, and there are other teachers I had where I can't think of one thing that ever happened in the classroom. And so a great teacher is just transformative and beautiful thing.
I think that is a perfect note to end on. So I think we will stop there. Thank you very much, Russ.
Thanks,
It's
Sarah.
been a delight.
Yeah. Enjoy.